Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day. So I'm Bonnie Isman. I'm representing the Historical Society today. Good to see everyone. And today we're having a wonderful talk, I'm sure, related to our current 2024 exhibit at the museum. The exhibit is about Cambodians here in Amherst and how they came and their resettlement process. It's an amazing exhibit. I encourage you to make time to come over. And with us today is Joan Snowdon, who was part of the committee that put together this fabulous exhibit. And Joan is going to tell us her history with the committee and with the Cambodian community. I'll hand it over to you, Joan.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Well, welcome everybody. So pleased to be here. And I have to start, first of all, by talking about how this whole thing got started and how our committee is 7 people, 4 Cambodian Americans who arrived in Amherst as refugees. Well, 3 of them did. One of them was the daughter of a refugee family. And then the other 3 are 2 people associated with the Historical Society, Rebecca Fricka and Mick O'Connor. And then I got called in later, once this was a go. So it was in the fall of 2022, the Amherst Historical Society had been discussing since 2019 or so. Rebecca told me about enlarging the scope of what the Historical Society was investigating and wanted to collect artifacts and display. And I'm going to actually read you what she said, because she said it so beautifully. I talked to her about this. She said, the museum in 2019 really started to turn attention to living history and to make the museum more accessible and to encourage residents of Amherst to think about themselves as part of history. So that's what Rebecca said, and I just wrote it down because I thought it was wonderfully put. And the Historical Society started with the Ancestral Bridges show, which documented African American families in Amherst, and then decided to take on telling the history of the Cambodian American community in Amherst. So it was after COVID. She said everything stopped. And then after COVID, fall of 2022, Rebecca Fricka and Mick O'Connor from the Historical Society met with Yana Oak, who were a young Cambodian American woman who works in Amherst Media, Khmer Rouge, who was a teacher at Fort River School and is currently working in the schools. And he was, let's say how old he came. He was 16, I think, when he and his mom and siblings arrived in Amherst. And then Sakane Mao, who's a famous resident of Amherst and whose photo is right up here. This is Sakane Mao, who he arrived at 17 years old, attended Amherst High School with this whole cohort that we'll learn about who came in the 80s, and then went on to go to UMass, ended up as a paraprofessional at the Fort River School, started with his family the Khmer Growers, a group of farmers, worked for HCAC, and then taught Khmer literature and culture and history at Amherst High School, which is where I met Sakane. So Sakane joined this group, and they met at the Leverett Temple, which is a Cambodian temple in Leverett, and they brought food to the monks, and they had a conversation with the monks and with 30 plus members of the Amherst, wider Amherst Cambodian community about doing an exhibit. And they brainstormed what should be in such an exhibit and what artifacts would tell the story of their experience. And I guess starting then in winter of 2023, the group started to plan the exhibit. And then I got a call to see would I like to be part of it, because I had been working with Cambodian families and I had many students who were Cambodian American. I said, yeah, I'd love to join you. And I'm the only retired person on the committee. That turned out to be key.
Yes.
Because, you know, everyone else had 1 or 2 jobs and families and was really busy. So anyway, that was our group of 7. Oh no, and then Lauren Room joined us. And Lauren used to work for the town of Amherst with Abby Bodie with the Board of Health as an outreach worker into the Cambodian community. She was younger than Sakane when she came. I think she was 12 years old, but you know, those Sakane and Lauren and Seha have deep memories of the war in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, the flight to the border, life in a refugee camp, and then finally being sponsored by churches in Amherst. And so for them, this show was delving into some really painful history. Yana represents the I guess she's kind of the 3rd generation. If you think of like Sakane's parents and Seha's parents, was the first, they brought their children. And some of them even brought their in-laws. So they brought their elders and their children to Amherst in the 80s, in the early 80s. And then those children, like Sakane and Seha and Lauren, now they've started families. And so Yana's of that generation. She was born here, doesn't speak the Khmer language well, and has never really heard from her parents about their experiences. She's read a lot about it, she's interested, but that wasn't something they talked about, partly because of language differences, but mostly because her parents didn't want to talk about it. And I think that's really common and in other groups too, refugee families. So in telling you how this got started, I've already told you about the committee, and that's key because it took a while for us to find our way. Mick was the project coordinator, and then of course, I'm going to mention you all. I gotta say, none of us is a historian. None of us ever put on an exhibit before. Mick and Rebecca knew about the Amherst Historical Society, and they knew quite a bit, but this is a different kind of thing, because this was living history, public history. We didn't have artifacts in the collection, so that was the gathering, finding, getting photographs. So we were kind of figuring it out as we went along, and we trusted each other. That was the hard thing, because people would do different things and have different strengths and offer different things, but our meetings were not like any meeting you would go to where there's an agenda, and and people get the agenda ahead of time, attend the meeting, just anything you want to add to the agenda, go through the agenda, read minutes from a previous meeting. None of that happened. People were busy, and yes, and some people weren't that comfortable reading email or communicating on email, didn't read emails sometimes. So it took a while to figure out how to communicate best with each other. Only time we could meet was Sundays, because everyone worked during the week. People lived in Chicopee, Belchertown, different places. But we pulled it together. We did it, and we trusted each other, and what the non-Khmer people on the committee felt like, this has to be authentic, and it has to represent as many families as we can. So that's not something we can do. It's not our story to tell, and we don't have those connections. So the process was laborious, because in the meetings, Mick and I would send agendas out, and people would ignore the agendas, and we would just gather and just start talking about the things we needed to talk about to get done, because everyone's busy. And so that's how it happened. Priorities would come to the top, and then small groups would work on different things, and we got there. And then the other challenge was, in wanting it to be really authentic, every panel, you'll see when you go to the exhibit, we started thinking we would have 8 to 10 panels. We have like 20 panels, right? It's dense. There's a lot of information, a lot of photographs, a lot of things to look at. And what we did was we would gather every Sunday either at the museum, when it got warm enough, but when it was cold, we gathered at Amherst Media, and we put the draft up with the photos and the text, and then and that's when we would have all of the Cambodian Americans there too, and start to read through it and end up changing so much, changing words, changing what I remember. I had a panel about the refugee camp, and I had read something about this camp talking about the food stations. So I wrote the food stations, and I said food stations. I said, yeah, you know, the United Nations was bringing food and distributing food at the food stations. He said, no, that's not. So, you know, we really strove to have things that were written about the history, especially in the refugee camps and in Cambodia, rewritten by the people who experienced it. So that was a big challenge. So the challenge of meeting, communicating, deciding was a big one. Another big challenge was just getting the photographs we needed and contacting people and getting accurate information. And my God, it was a lot. It's a lot. But we were all really committed to this project. At one point, when it felt like things were just too painful, like, is this just too painful to be starting to look at photographs of being in the refugee camp, or right, you know, reading, is this just, and they said, no, Seha said, this is important, people need to know, this is what a refugee is, this is why, you know, things were hard in Cambodia, and things were also hard in the refugee camp. So that was our process, and luckily we had Amherst Historical Society. Gigi and Liz were right there with us and helped write grants. And so we got funding from wonderful people that made this possible. Mass Humanities, Asian American Pacific Islander Commission of Massachusetts and UMass. Amherst Media was so great because a big part early on, they decided, the group, before I even joined, the group decided the elders are dying. The people who remember life before the Khmer Rouge took over, they're dying. So we need to interview them. So Yana, who works at Amherst Media, her boss Jim Lesso, supported her involvement in this project, and also they helped fund doing oral interviews with elders in the community, filming those interviews, and in some cases we have translation. Some were done in English or Khmer, and the translation part is tricky with captions. And they're still working on that. This is an ongoing thing. They haven't interviewed all the people they want to. And we had great involvement from 2 high school students who showed up, who wanted to be involved, and they were trained by UMass to conduct oral history interviews. And so having them asking the questions out of real curiosity to an elder was very powerful. It was very powerful. So Amherst Media was a big partner in this. The Amherst Cultural Council also gave us financial support, as did UMass. So thank you, Gigi, and whatever, the group, because we had the resources we needed to do all of the editing of the films, and also creating all the panels that are in the exhibit. And Amherst Cinema also got involved in the process. I think it was mixed, and we should show a movie along with this. And we had a bunch of movies we were considering, like The Killing Fields, which was about the horrors of the Khmer Rouge years. And the Cambodians said, nah, Nah, and basically said, it was worse than that. It was worse than the movie show. But no, and so what they wanted to show was this movie that was a documentary, was filmed in 1992 called Rebuilding the Temple. And it was a documentary by two young filmmakers in Florentine Films, Larry Hott and Claudia Levin, who've gone on to have all these careers in documentary film now. She runs her own production company called Monadnock Films. Anyway, they took on the project of interviewing the Cambodians who were building this elaborate temple, Cambodian temple, and ended up interviewing a lot of people in the community and the Cambodian community in Texas, and they just delved deep. And so we got the rights to show that film at the Amherst Cinema. Amherst Cinema made it possible, and we showed it on May 8th, and it was sold out. We were amazed. And Larry and Claudia showed up for a Q&A after the film. And they showed up at the opening of the exhibit too.
Good.
Yeah, so this process has, it was possible through all these connections. Lauren and others in the Cambodian community reached out and asked families for photographs, some objects, some things, and they responded. And so we have fabulous photographs that do represent many families. That was a big part. In fact, some, like one of our sessions, they're looking, they're saying, no, we already have too many pictures from that family, Oh, okay. So that was a goal of ours. And also, I started reaching out to the people who had sponsored the refugee families. And that was opened up a whole, the show, things just got deeper and deeper the more we went. We were like, this is an amazing story. This has to be in the exhibit, and that has to be in the exhibit. And so there's a lot to see and read and think about. But for me, it was really wonderful to sit down with people like Liz Bell from Wesley Methodist Church, who was married to Ron Bell, who was the superintendent in the 80s. And she gave me all these photos of the many Cambodian families that Wesley Methodist sponsored, and told me what that was like, to go to the airport and have a family arrive with nothing, just these bags. We have a copy of these bags that all the refugees were issued with their documents in it, their immunization records, all their refugee documents, for the whole family. So someone has to hang on to that bag as they go from airport to airport and end up at Bradley. And they all wore these same jackets that the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service would issue, and that was sort of a joke, and lo and behold, a family donated. They kept their jackets. They all kept their papers, and so we have the jackets in the exhibit. Yeah, it was something, and so I got the story from the sponsors of why Amherst. Why did Amherst end up to be a place where there were, how many families was there? I'm trying to think. And just in terms, I never could get a very clear, number about the population, but by 1992, there were 650 Cambodians living in the Pioneer Valley. 40% of them lived in Amherst. And that was about 350 people at that point. But later it was about, the number I heard is it went up to 500 in the Amherst, Northampton, East Hampton area. That was the height of the number. That's small compared to Long Beach, California, where there's a big Cambodian community, and Lowell, Mass. Has a large Cambodian community also. But Amherst community, when I got into asked why Amherst, it all comes down to this Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service was the agency that was processing refugee applications from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam and from Cambodia and Laos. And they developed this philosophy called clustering, And we say it's better for families to be clustered in a community than to be just randomly, sponsored by a church here and a church there, because of the need to be together as a community. And in our case, to build not one temple, but 2 temples. There's a Cambodian temple in Pelham also. And that, which was so essential to healing. So, the story is that Governor Dukakis was very favorably, wanted to make it easier for refugees from Southeast Asia to come in and to have jobs, and that's why Lowell, it became a big center too. And Kitty Dukakis went to the border and saw the camps, and so she came back and told her husband, these people need to get out, we need to find sponsors. So she was someone who was going around Massachusetts with refugees and with some other people who had been to the refugee camp and saw the conditions in the refugee camp, and we're speaking mostly at churches, because Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services is church-based, and they wisely knew that churches are very well positioned they're well organized. It's a way to really help families settle. Resettlement is challenging. So Amherst, it started in Amherst because Mount Toby Friends meeting, the Quaker meeting, had been involved in famine relief. The American Friends Service Committee had been, the conditions were so bad, which explains the refugees. People were starving in Cambodia. They were aware of the plight of Cambodians, and other church groups became aware of the plight of Cambodians. So when there was this need for sponsors of refugee families, once the State Department, Jimmy Carter, figured out how to streamline this process for Southeast Asian refugees, these churches wanted to be part of it. And once there were like a few churches here, then there was people from the LIRS came out and went and spoke at churches all in the area, because they wanted to cluster families in the Pioneer Valley. So that's why Amherst ended up. So I'm going to talk for a few more minutes, and I did have a plan, but I've been kind of off topic. Then we can do question and answer. I won't go into the history of Cambodia, but in case you don't know, it got caught up in the Vietnam War. Our United States bombed eastern Cambodia in the late 60s and early 70s, and that led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. And they were fanatical, they were Maoist, they emptied the cities, they literally forced people, they emptied cities and forced people into these agricultural labor camps where everyone would be equal. Children were taken from parents, monks were derobed, temples were destroyed, the whole educational system was destroyed. They had re-education schools in the labor camps. These were forced labor camps. They were trying to kind of create this new, perfect, utopian, classless society by force. And then one of the worst parts of it is that anyone who was educated was executed. And I'm not exaggerating, it was So the Khmer Rouge were in charge from 75 to 79, 74 to 79. 75, 4 years, 75 to 79, and there was this mass starvation because this wasn't working. These forced labor camps, and 2 million people died in 4 years. It was so bad. And the Vietnamese army in 75 came into Cambodia and started to battle the Khmer Rouge, and that caused war, but it also caused disruption, and that's when people could flee. So they fled west to Thailand, across the border, and there were about 9 different refugee camps on the border with Thailand. And the one camp where our families came from was called Khao Dang, and it was started in 79. It was finally closed in 1993. because the fighting continued. It was still very dangerous. And our families were in the Khmer, some for 3 years, 4 years, you know, they were many years in this refugee camp. It was run by the United Nations. Lots of volunteer organizations were there, Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, a lot of different, it was a place where people had hope and got help. But it was still, as you'll see if you come to the exhibit, life in the refugee camp was not easy. So our families who came here in 81, first family 81, then a bunch in 82, 83, 84. So if you were in Amherst those years, you might know, and if you were in one of the churches who were involved, there were 7 churches, and they got so organized. Their records are in the Jones Library Special Collection, the minutes of their meetings. It's so fascinating because hundreds of Amherst people were involved in helping the refugees get resettled. I didn't realize each church had these committees, you know, the drivers and the food shoppers and the ESL taking them to the Jones Library, because that was when you started your ESL program, the Jones Library in the early 80s. Bonnie wrote the first grant. Bonnie and Beth wrote that first grant that got funding for an ESL program in Amherst. And then later, Lynn Weintraub was hired, and she added the citizenship component because the families who were here still had families back in the refugee camp. And then when Reagan was elected, things changed, and he was basically saying we don't need to take any more. They can all be repatriated back to Cambodia. We don't need to accept any more. And the Vietnamese boat people, they're all here, there aren't any more. You know, the State Department changed. And so this is where these posters come in, because Amherst, being Amherst, said, wait a minute, our families have relatives there. They should be able to sponsor them and bring them. So it says here, help save lives of Cambodian refugees still in camps in Thailand. Volunteers needed. And this guy, Richard Brown, Ecumenical Refugee Ministry, I got in touch with him. He lives in Chicago with his sister. And that's where I got the story. I said, okay, how did Amherst end up being the place? He goes, well, so I have a picture of him in the exhibit too. So Amherst, this was before the internet, so this group called themselves Cambodian Crisis Committee. Write letters of concern to President Reagan, ask him to help with family reunification, blah, 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 blah. And they went to Washington, and they took refugee adults from our community with them, and to go to lobby Congress. And darned if they didn't change the policy. I mean, not just Amherst, but other churches too ended up changing the refugee processing policy in the Reagan administration. Yeah, join this national grassroots mail-in. Your letters can bring new hope to the Khmer New Year. Now, I say the word Khmer, I say the word Khmer, I say Cambodian. It's Khmer, but for years I said Khmer, and so it's hard. I sometimes say Khmer. But our folks would say, no, we don't say Khmer, we say Khmer. And Khmer is the language, Khmer is the culture. So all Cambodians are Khmer. And so Kane explained it. Cambodia is the name of the nation, but it was named other things. Under the French colonization, it was French Indochina. And before that, parts of Cambodia were parts of other empires and things. But we are Khmer people. We have always been Khmer people. So even though we're now in Amherst, even though we're American citizens and our children don't even speak Khmer, we're still Khmer. I think I'm going to stop there. Yeah. I'm sure I've left out a huge amount about this exhibit. I just love you to see it. It ended up being really good. We're all amazed how good it is. No, it's just the combination of the oral history stuff and the information and the visuals, the artifacts. It all came together. Okay, questions? Comments?
I just wanted to say, I know when I was in Amherst in the 70s, the peace movement was very strong in Amherst. And I thought maybe that was part of the reason that the refugee resettlement came to Amherst. But the way you've explained it with the Friends Service Committee, that makes a lot of sense.
I think that was part of the peace movement too, being
Yeah.
aware of what was happening in Southeast Asia, in the politics of Southeast Asia. Amherst was particularly aware of that. Yes?
The period where the unaccompanied minors,
Oh, yeah.
they came with these people or at a different time?
The unaccompanied minors is part of the story. These were orphans, basically. I mean, these were children who showed up in the refugee camp with no family. But they didn't necessarily know if their family was still alive because they'd been separated from their family and sent to a labor camp. And some of them had tried to find family, but had kind of taken in with other families, helped them get to the camp. So there's this whole collection, they called unaccompanied minors. It's a term that's used today too for a young person who's a refugee but doesn't have a family. And they weren't allowed to be adopted, but they were placed in foster homes in Amherst. And that was part of what Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services did. It was one of their programs, family settlement and unaccompanied minor settlement. And some of those, we had 14 unaccompanied minors in Amherst, but then Richard Brown's wife, Marlena, got hired by LIRS to actually find more foster families in the whole area. And so she ended up settling 40 unaccompanied minors, between 81 and 85, I think. And you know someone who, she had two.
Yes.
T. Ewan and
My
Barrett.
current neighbor had two foster boys who were, I think they were not teenagers when they arrived. They were younger than teenagers.
Yeah, I think they were young teenagers. No, T. and Barrett, right?
And T, whom I've met and know fairly well at this point, he has been a math teacher in Lowell for years. And his son, Gia, I also know quite well, because they've come to help their mother. But T's brother, and I don't know his name, decided to go back to Cambodia.
Oh, Barrett. I know.
For good.
Yeah.
And Jean and Key have gone and visited the Cambodia several years ago. So that's really why I'm here, because I've gotten to know Key and Gina, and they're just great people. It was wonderful that they could come here.
Yeah. I mean, I want a moment at the exhibition, Liz Bell and Ginny Kilmer and Jane Sykes were there. They're now elderly ladies, and they had been in the Wesley Methodist Church and sponsored the Boo family. And there was this moment where Long Boo, who was 12 when she arrived, came into the exhibit, and these three women were there. Oh my God. I mean, Long just looked at them and just ran over, and the three of them just hugged her, and they're crying. I'm crying. It was so emotional, because there was a lot of emotion. And Long turned to me, she said, "These are my angels. They saved my life." No, she said, "I'm here today because of them. Or I am who I am today because of them." Yeah, so the impact, I mean, this wasn't part of the original story, kind of. The story was the experience of the refugees coming, and then we realized there's this other story, which is the Amherst part of the story, of the churches and the clusters and how those people's lives were changed by this. Like Jean, right? Yeah. Yes. No?
Well,
You were
I was-
here.
well,
Yeah?
I became aware of the farming going on. I think I was aware of it in the abstract anyway, but then I moved to that part of Amherst, and so I was not far away. But I didn't really know how, I mean, probably the people involved in doing it, and it was a pretty big farm for a while, a vegetable farm for a while there. But the way you farm in Cambodia, I imagine, had differences from the way you farm in Amherst, as, you know, the soils and the climate and possibly even the tools. And I don't know if you know anything about that transition or anything, I mean, because
Yeah,
it's
that's
obviously different than being in a school, but.
Oh, no, I was aware because I would visit families in the different apartment complexes in town. And it was once the family, you know, when they came, they were often in temporary housing. There was the yellow house on Main Street that was, well, the committee figured out housing, and there were housing vouchers to
And then they get moved somewhere else.
But once they kind of got settled somewhere, usually in one of the Amherst Crossing or what was called Brittany Manor, the Boulders, they would start farming there. They would ask the landlord if they could just, they were given plots of land. So we have some photographs that show these little gardens with strings and beans and things, and it was very healing. Because many of, Thailand is on the west, and many of that, where the families came from, Battambang province and all was agricultural. And that's what they knew, the older people especially, they knew farming. And so starting to grow foods, and then they got connected to getting seeds, and
yeah, that'd be tricky to get the right seeds.
Yeah, get the right seeds. So this whole thing started, and then it went to another level. Like at Brittany Manor, there was a farm. At Amherst Crossing, there was plots, and then the Amherst Community Gardens. Yeah, those families would join together and get a big plot. There was a lot of farming. You're right, going on in the 80s there. But then the town Pete Westover from the conservation, there was those 3 acres of land out.
Wentworth Farm,
Yeah, and they leased, that's when the big farm started. And they did end up actually using tools from Cambodia, machetes and stuff. And they made some money. They were selling Asian vegetables to restaurants in Boston, Washington, and New York. And come to the exhibit, there's a whole panel on the Khmer growers. They were then sending some of those proceeds back to Cambodia to rebuild temples and rebuild schools in their home towns.
The knives are so interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, Gigi?
I just want to say a few comments on behalf of the Historical Society. A word you use several times is trust. And the generosity of the Cambodian community members towards this exhibition is phenomenal. I mean, they really have entrusted precious family treasures, and I hope you all come see it. As far as the trustees go, I must say we kept abreast of the progress, but you'll notice we didn't, I hope, come in and try to be overbearing. It was really a hands-off. We trusted the team. In fact, I learned more about the team today than I had ever known in the past year. And I'll share, there's so many stories to share about this, but one, several of us are greeters at the Historical Society, and it's been a privilege the last several weeks to really watch some of these reunions of people coming in, some Cambodians with former teachers or neighbors. Last Saturday, the former principal of the Jackson Street School in Northampton came. She knew my niece, my great niece and great nephew, but she also had Yana in one of her courses. And it's been just wonderful to listen in on conversations and witness the thrill that the Cambodians have. I mean, it's very much a two-way street. They're, from what I understand, incredibly grateful to be able to tell their story and to re-experience it. And I think that's something Yana talks about a bit. But for us, it's given us, I think, a sense of purpose, rebirth. It's been a fabulous experience. Like Rachel, I've hung around exhibitions for a long time, and I was afraid. I saw the drafts of the text up on the walls for weeks, and I thought, uh-oh, what's going to happen here? Well, what I hadn't seen was the integration of text and image, which is just brilliantly done, and I believe we have Joan to thank for a lot of that, if not all of that work. It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
And makes me much less afraid of future text-heavy exhibitions, because if you're going to tell history, you've got to tell it, and often it's the word that does it, and it can be a little daunting. Museums today have 150-word limits.
It's about time to wrap up, and I know we really appreciate.
Oh, good. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.